We know what John wrote. And so that is where we hang our hat on. It's not necessarily that this English translation, like you mentioned, the KJV only guys, we're not our rule and sole authority isn't the English translation. It's what John wrote. We just understand this is a translation of what John wrote, and we believe that this is accurate.
Hey, welcome back to Campfire Apologetics. I'm Mark Hudson, and this is where I help give the everyday Christian tools to help defend their faith in a hostile culture. And today I'm joined with Ben Lamp, who is he runs Grace and Truth Ministries, and he just told me that he is now the executive director of End Abortion Maryland. So he is partnered with the End Abortion Now guys from Apologia, if you're familiar with them, Apologia Studios, Apologia Radio, Apologia Church. I'm not sure which one of those entities runs End Abortion Now, but they're all connected. And he is kind of partnered with them to try and end abortion in Maryland. Although today's discussion is not about abortion, maybe we will do that at a later date. I've had quite a few videos on that topic, and it's something that's an ongoing discussion, and it's something we need to continue to talk about. But today we're actually talking about texts that are found later in the manuscript traditions, like the woman caught in adultery, at the end of John 7 and beginning of John 8, and the longer ending of Mark. If we have time, we will get into the longer ending of Mark, but we're going to be talking about whether or not those are authentic texts. Are they original to the text? Should we preach from those texts from the pulpit? Should we be preaching them as though they are authoritative, God-breathed words of God? So anyway, Ben, I will hand it over to you. I'll let you kind of give us a little rundown of who you are and what you do, and we'll go from there. Thanks for coming on, man.
Oh, Mark, thanks for having me, man. I appreciate the introduction there. Yeah, so Grace and Truth Ministries is an apologetics ministry. We put out training materials and videos much like yours, and just talk about the culture and the truth from a biblical worldview. And then End Abortion Maryland, obviously we fight to end abortion in Maryland. But I appreciate you, man. It was that was a very sweet introduction, and I love this topic. And looking to dive right in, man. So do you want to read it, or you want to? How do you want to do this, man?
Well, let's see here. Let me. If you already have it pulled up, I would say you could read it.
I can read it, or if you want to just kind of, I can briefly discuss kind of why we talk about this in general, sure. Because I'm sure that most of your viewers know a little bit about textual criticism and textual variants that are in the Bible, this one being one of the most famous. But I'm also, there are probably many either new Christians or people that just haven't dug into this that are unaware completely of what the heck we're talking about. So
so I would say, I'd give it the little caveat that if you are somebody who's listening to this episode and you are unfamiliar with what textual criticism is, I do have an episode that I did with Robbie Lashua. He was with Stand to Reason. They're in another apologetic ministry run by Greg Kokel. But I did an episode with him on the issue of textual criticism. Now, we didn't really dive too much into this text or the longer ending of Mark. We just talked really just about what textual criticism is in general. But if you're somebody who's not familiar with what that is, I would encourage you to go find that episode and watch it and familiarize yourself a little bit with that before maybe digging into this. It might give you a little more of a foundation for understanding kind of what we're getting at now. There's a lot of people out there who talk about this issue as well, and one of my favorite is Dr. James White. He talks about the issue of textual criticism quite a bit. He's even done debates on the issue, and so go check out his stuff as well. But with that said, we'll just go into this kind of assuming that people know what we're talking about when it comes to textual criticism. But Yeah, go ahead. I'll let you kind of get into like why is this part of the discussion? Why do we talk about this? What is it that we're talking about, right?
Okay, great. So, textual criticism in a nutshell is there's a long, whenever you have a writing of antiquity, like the Bible, you have manuscripts thousands of years old that you study, and then through a textual criticism and textual copying process, a manuscript tradition, you come to the Bible in which we have today. But part of that is many copies and recopies of older manuscripts that have been found. And so when you have the Bible, there's thousands of manuscripts, whether it's a fraction of a book or you go to Codex Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, which have the entire biblical narrative. And so it's very important to go to the oldest manuscripts to as the great river, in other words, and have the other ones kind of stream from that. So you want to start
Yeah.
with as oldest as you can go, and then reference those first. And there's some other principles as
Unless
well. Go ahead.
unless you're a KJV onlyist.
Well, then that's your standard, and you have
Yeah,
other things to work out in your
yeah,
theology.
yeah. I agree.
Oh, we should do that's a whole nother
I plan on
podcast.
doing something with
Absolutely.
that too.
Yeah, that's a whole other podcast, my man.
Oh,
Um,
absolutely. I was just throwing a little joke in there. Now tell me if you agree with this or not. The way that I kind of describe textual criticism is I mean, in what you said was dead on, but I feel like it's just there's kind of there's layers to it. There's a lot to the issue of textual criticism, but it's kind of the art and science of getting to what the original text actually says with all of the thousands of manuscripts that we have, because there are variants, basically small differences in text through the manuscripts because they were copied by multiple people over a long period of time. And so that's naturally going to give you some variance. And so what it does is it takes all of these different manuscripts and it compares them, and then it basically is getting us back to what is the original and what does the original say. And so I think with confidence we could say that the Bibles that we have today do contain all of the original content of the Bible because of what we've done through textual criticism. Now, yeah, I don't know if you would agree with that or not, but that's kind of how I always look at it in a nutshell, if that makes sense. But
I would absolutely agree, and I would throw in that that's a great point to say that with textual criticism, the non-believer or possibly the atheist that's against the Bible would look at that and say, well, listen, you have the reason you don't have your complete Bible because either it's been copied a bunch of times and there's errors, and the fact that we know that there's quote unquote errors, we'll call them, or variants, we should say, that the fact that there's variants discredits the Bible when actually it's the reverse that's true. Because we have so many manuscripts, we know exactly what the Bible says. Because even if you take 100 manuscripts, there's a lot of rules and with textual criticism, and we don't have to get into all of them, but if obviously all 100 say the same thing in paragraph A, then you just copy paragraph A. But if you have a variant, let's say one of those has something different, then you have 99 that say so very clearly you can kind of get to the real biblical text. And even with passages like the longer ending in Mark, or the rendering of the woman caught in adultery here in John, even if those aren't in the original manuscripts, which is something we'll talk about shortly, it doesn't mean that we don't have the full Bible. We still have the full Bible, and perhaps a story that was added that, there's most of the evidence points to the story actually being true. It's just that we don't know that John wrote it. So even if that is added to the Bible we hold in our hands today, we're not missing the Bible. If anything, we have more,
yeah,
than what the Bible originally produced and what John wrote. And so
yeah,
I would say through manuscript tradition, we have overwhelming evidence that what we hold in our hands is the Bible, what John wrote, and then maybe perhaps a story that was added later. Again, that and we also have to be sure. I'll throw this in here. When a reformed guy like you or I say sola scriptura, we're not saying that. We're saying what John wrote is true, and what John wrote is inerrant. We understand that it's been copied many, many, many times over, and we also understand that there's possible variants like we have here. We know what John wrote, and so that is where we hang our hat on. It's not necessarily that this English translation, like you mentioned, the KJV only guys, we're not our rule and sole authority isn't the English translation. It's what John wrote. We just understand this is a translation of what John wrote, and we believe that this is accurate.
Yeah, it's the manuscript tradition, right? And so we're talking about the story of the woman caught in adultery, which is John 7:53 through John 8:11. Now, I'll let you read that passage. I'm sure everybody's probably very familiar with that passage, and then maybe we can get into the discussion of where this comes from. So yeah, go ahead and read through that text there, and just
absolutely, man.
Bible reading on here, and then we can get into it.
Yeah, no problem. So starts in John chapter 7, starting at verse 53. They went each to his own house, but Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. Early in the morning, he came again to the temple. All the people came to him, and he sat down and taught them. The scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in adultery. And placing her in the midst, they said to him, "Teacher, this woman has been caught in the act of adultery. Now, in the law of Moses commanded us to stone such woman. So what do you say?" They said this to test him, that they might have some charge to bring against him. Jesus bent down and wrote with his finger on the ground. And as they continued to ask him, he stood up and said to them, "Let him who is without sin among you be the first to throw a stone at her." And once more he bent down and wrote on the ground. But when they heard it, they went away one by one, beginning with the older ones, and Jesus was left alone with the woman standing before him. Jesus stood up and said to her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" She said, "No one, Lord." And Jesus said, "Neither do I condemn you. Go, and from now on sin no more." So really quickly, just interesting as we get into it, my Bible is an ESV Luther study Bible, so I have a lot of commentary from Luther. I don't agree with all of Luther's theology. I'll throw that out there now. But I love a lot of his stuff, and he's also got other stuff. And at the very beginning of this whole section, it says the earliest manuscripts do not include 753 through 811. And most Bibles that are sold today have some sort of note. Most include it, but they all have a note that says, "Hey, this isn't in the original manuscripts." And that alone tells you that that should give you hope in the manuscript tradition itself, just because that note is still there.
I also want to note is like putting that note in there is showing that Christians have been transparent all throughout history.
Absolutely.
Like, it's something
great point.
We've known about this forever. We're not trying to hide anything. It's something that made its way into the text. And so we put a note in there and we said, "Hey, look, we care about the original manuscripts. We care about the oldest manuscripts and what these things say. And so we want you to know that this wasn't actually in the original manuscripts. This was a tradition that kind of carried throughout history, and it made its way into the text." And I think, personally, if you go through and you read the rest of the Gospels and you read really the rest of the Bible and everything leading up to the Messiah coming in, inaugurating his kingdom and all of that, nothing in this story is really out of place or unusual or out of the character that we know of Jesus, right? So I think that because of that, it carried some weight and it made its way in. And just kind of like getting into some of the earliest and best Greek manuscripts that we have, it's not included or it's missing from Papyrus 66, which is dated around 200 AD. It's missing from Papyrus 75, which is dated around 175 to 225. And like you mentioned earlier, it's missing from Codex Sinaiticus and Codex Vaticanus, which are both 4th century. And those are some of the earliest witnesses to John's gospel that we have. And so we don't have it in those. And so because of that, I would say that it is probably not original to the text. Now, I'll also throw the caveat in there and say that John also says that there are many things that Jesus said and did that I could never fit in this book. And so it is very possible that that is one of those things that he just didn't include in the book, but did really happen. So it is possible that that is a real story that just didn't make it into John, and it kind of made its way throughout history and landed. But it doesn't always, it's not always anyway, found in John in manuscripts. Sometimes it's found in Luke. I think, yeah, in my notes anyway, I have Luke 21:38 or Luke 24:53.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes it lands in Luke, and in other manuscripts, it lands in different places in John. It's not always in after 752. Sometimes it's 736 or John 21. And I think if you take that, like what you just read, right? If you take John 53 or 753 through 811, if you take it out and you just read John 52 and skip past that story, it's much more it flows so much better. You know, like it feels like it's kind of forced in there, like it's like this odd thing that's just like plopped into the middle of this narrative, and it tells the story, and then it picks right back up where it was. Like it definitely feels like it's this odd place, like it doesn't really belong there. What are your thoughts on that?
No, I agree, man, with everything that you said. Yeah, no, it's certainly, there's a lot there, man. It does just, it's kind of plopped in. Most early scholars believe, well, first of all, you mentioned it's definitely a story that you could see Jesus doing this based on the Gospels. We understand who Jesus is. So we understand that this is very likely how he would behave. And what's probably most likely happened in the case of this passage is that it was a story, popular story, that was circulating. And so, you know, by the time we get to the copy tradition to you know, we get to the 2nd century, you know, 150 to 200, when you have 66 and then P75 found, and that's early, and then you get to, you mentioned Vaticanus and Sinaiticus in the 4th century. They're not in those, but this story has been word of mouth down the generations to father to son and so forth. And so by the time you get to like the 8th and 9th, you know, it's almost like, well, guys, we gotta put this somewhere, because this is a huge, compelling, emotional story from Jesus our Lord. And so they I think that they try, perhaps, and you can see through the Byzantine text types are most of the ones that have it elsewhere, like in Luke, and sometimes it's even before. It's in between 7 and 8. It's kind of plopped, and sometimes it's even like there's one manuscript that has it as a floating text, right? And it's just it's in there, but it's not really. It doesn't have really a verse. It's just kind of in there in between Luke and John. And so, yeah, they're definitely like, listen, guys, we need this story. It's a powerful story, you know, to engage with, but we don't know who wrote it. We don't know where, you know, we don't know, or maybe nobody wrote it and it's just a story that's been down. So we're going to put it in. And yeah, you really don't start to see that. You really don't start to see that until, you know, 8th, 9th century. You have, and another interesting thing, they're always past the 10th century. They're always asterisks, or there's a note or a note in the margin that says something like, this story wasn't in the original, the oldest manuscripts, which speaks to Christians and scholars being transparent throughout history. Yeah. So if you took it out and you just placed it here on the side, John definitely flows. You know, there's
Yeah.
no doubt about it. He's the light of the world, and he's talking. You know, he's teaching, and then this the story's thrown in about this woman has really nothing to do with the context surrounding it. So it definitely
Yeah.
feels that way. Most historians, I don't know of any besides non-Christian scholars, say that this happened. There's a lot of historical evidence that this happened, and so we can hang our hat on that. That is obviously it speaks to Jesus's character. It's not contradictory to his character. It's also not contradictory to other scenes in John and the other gospels where the Pharisees tried to catch Jesus. This has happened before. So it's
Right.
not odd in that way either. Um,
Right.
there is an interesting thing about this passage, though, that is a little odd or unique, maybe we should say. This is the only time recorded in the Bible of Jesus writing something, and it was on the ground, you know, perhaps in the
Yeah.
sand or in the dirt. It's
Yeah.
not like he took out paper and wrote, but
Yeah.
which is interesting because that could hold some theological weight. Jesus never writes anywhere else. He's a carpenter. You know, it does speak to some literary understanding at minimum. Obviously, he's God, but we're talking about him in his incarnation here. But that is a unique thing just to mention because the fact that we say this is the only place in Scripture that he writes, and we're talking about whether it should be included in Scripture is interesting. I think at least to bring up. But yeah, so as you mentioned, many that's left out of. There's many more than that. Codex LTXY, all of them don't have. These are all from basically the 2nd century to the 10th. Basically, none of the Alexandrian text types, that stream of manuscripts, have them.
The oldest.
And then the oldest, and Alexandrian is the oldest, and I would argue most important. So Sinaiticus, without doubt, is the most important, and Vaticanus right up there with it. So it's not in both of those, which is really telling. Now, I'm not saying that's. We have a lot of other earlier manuscripts, not full Bible manuscripts, sections of John, like 66, P66, and P75. But the fact that they're not included in that is very telling. And like I said, hundreds of others that don't have it, and they really don't start seeing it until Byzantine comes in, and they're way later. So it's certainly interesting. You mentioned that it does flow without it, and that's completely true. And so it does seem like it's added later. But again, I will say there's a lot of evidence to support that the story actually happened, and just some of the literary evidence of Jesus's character. There's other scenes that this has happened. The Pharisees have tried to catch Jesus. So even if you take those alone and don't do any studying historically at all, it doesn't contradict Jesus, and as you mentioned, there's no theological issues with it being added either. It's just probably likely not. It's just likely it was not in the original manuscript, so it's likely not. It wasn't what John wrote. Likely is
right.
what I would say.
I think if John wrote it originally, then they'd be able to remember where John put it. You know, like
absolutely. Absolutely.
Like, I think James White, I think the way he puts it is something like a genuine original reading doesn't wander around the New Testament. You know, they know where it goes. They know where it was found. And there's a lot of scholars that notice things about the text that they actually say sounds more like it was from Luke. Like it was actually like the vocabulary sounds a little more like Luke, and the style feels a little more like Luke. And then again, like I mentioned, some manuscripts actually do place it inside of Luke. But again, that doesn't prove that Luke wrote it in any way, but it could strongly suggest that scribes knew that it was like an authentic Christian tradition or Christian story, and may have just not know where it belonged. And so that's kind of where it ended up just falling into place. Now what's actually kind of interesting is Augustine's comments on it. I don't know if you've ever looked into that, but Now, I wasn't like specifically looking into this, but it's just something that kind of came up. So around 400 AD, Augustine actually suggested that there were some copyists who intentionally removed this story because they feared that people would abuse Jesus' mercy and use it to excuse adultery. So it's kind of interesting historically, but there's no manuscript evidence really proving that that happened at all. It's just kind of Augustine's, thoughts or explanations on it. Did I lose you? You look like you froze there.
Me now? Got me?
I got you now.
Oh, sorry.
No, you're good. Did you hear all that?
So no. I had you the whole time. So yeah, I think it's a perfect example of a huge, a very, inspirational church father trying to explain it. He's trying to explain why, because today we have a way more manuscript tradition than he had then. So he's trying to explain, there's a variant, why, and so I have heard an argument that says, well, you're obviously you needed the reason that Jesus let the woman off the hook is because the law also says you need the man present. Right. And so she's off the hook, and I don't want to say off the hook as far as her sin, which is not what Jesus does. Jesus kind of says he's talking about the law that she broke, not the sin. Yeah, and so she's not condemned under the law because it wasn't a just trial. The man wasn't there, and per the law of Moses, the man has to be there as well. So she was never going to be condemned per the law. She's condemned from the sin, which Jesus can certainly and does forgive. And that's what he decides to do it because he's Jesus, but he says, go and sin no more. So even if this was something John wrote, which, as you mentioned, literally doesn't sound like he did, but even if he did, it doesn't contradict anything. So no. I think what the church fathers did was try to explain, well, it was added, the reason it was taken away or the reason it's in there or vice versa is just trying to like understand, have people understand that it's still Jesus's character. He didn't break any laws. He's not rewriting the law, which is another common claim with Jesus as you read the New Testament versus the Old Testament, and that goes down to misunderstandings. But yeah, I think there's a lot through church history. There's a lot of explaining and trying to understand. I think we're in a way better place today to explain it and kind of see what happened throughout history because we have access to all those manuscripts.
Yeah. Yeah, I think kind of talking about that whole law aspect of it, like Jesus didn't hold her accountable to the law and so they didn't stone her and all this and that. I think there's also a point in which we're seeing the grace and mercy and love of Christ in the New Testament and also seeing how the new covenant works versus the old covenant. So I think there's kind of a distinction to be made there as well. But yes, to your point, I don't personally think that this was an original John writing. And again, that doesn't bother me at all because this is something that has been throughout the text, in all of church history. It's not something that just came out of nowhere and we have no thoughts on it and nobody's addressed it in history before. It's not like some hidden thing. And again, like you said, or like we've already articulated, I don't think that there's anything theologically off here. There's nothing out of place with Jesus' character. I think that this could have very well been something that did happen, but it just wasn't originally written. I'm totally fine with that. Now, so then it comes down to the discussion of should we preach this, right? Like, should pastors be preaching this text from the pulpit? What are your thoughts? What do you think that we can preach this text? Should we preach this text? Should we avoid it? Should we preach it with caveats? Like how should we think about this?
Okay, my opinion is there's a couple different ways to approach this. If we're expositing the text, if we're going line by line preaching the Gospel of John, I think that when you arrive at this section of Scripture, you have a duty to inform your congregation that this very likely is not in the Bible.
Right.
And when I say the Bible, it's not something that John wrote. So I would maybe read it to your congregation. If you get to this section, I wouldn't skip it. I would read it, but I would say this is very likely not something John wrote. I'll read the story, but I wouldn't exposit as if it's something John wrote.
Right.
Because I don't think you can. Now,
it's not really
does that
like
mean
a
that
proper context to put it in? Because
absolutely, because we don't, and really, it's not even the small chance that it is inspired. We don't know that for certainty. And because we don't know it for certainty, I think pastors have an obligation to be truthful with their congregations rather than emotional, right? And so, because that's, if you think about it, that's how most of this story's preached. You have entire sermons preached on the emotional piece of Jesus in this because it is compelling. It's very compelling. There's no doubt about that. So that's one. If we're expositing the text line by line, I would not preach this section. Now, if you are referencing the story in a sermon, I'm not fully against referencing the story with the caveat that this is not something John wrote, but it does have a strong manuscript tradition past the 10th century, and it's got a strong historical tradition of being something that actually happened. Now, you don't know that for certainty.
Right.
And so if you say that up front to your congregation, I think you're off the hook as a pastor. You're not leading them astray, in other words, because you have given them the information that you have. I have information that says, look in your Bibles. Your Bible likely says this is not in the earliest manuscripts. It's here now because it's been, at this point, there's 500 years of 1,000 years going back of it being included in Bibles, printed texts.
Yeah.
So it's fine to say, obviously everybody already knows this story. If you're a churchgoer for any length of time, you've heard about this story. Even if you don't know where it is in the Bible, you've very likely heard this story.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
But I wouldn't preach it in a way. I would never say it's infallible because we simply don't know. We don't know with certainty. We don't know with certainty as if we know John 1:1 is, right?
Yeah, right.
So that's how I would preach it. Now, I'm not going to condemn a pastor who does exposit the text because he's confident because it's been in the Bible for so long, and it has. There's no question about that. It's been in the Bible. I would have an issue not letting your congregation know the history of it, though.
Absolutely.
Because that is misleading, because this is such a compelling story that you could see how because this is such a compelling story, we're going to put it in there. Even if it's, let's say it's folklore, right? Even if there's no, the person who sat down and wrote it for the first time, who had heard it, they don't know either because they weren't there. So it becomes a little bit of a mystery. It becomes a little bit of a folklore type of story, but it's so compelling that these people need to know, even with good intentions.
Yeah.
But the fact that you don't know for certainty that that's what John wrote, you have to tell your congregations that.
Yeah, I agree with everything you said. I think the problem lies with a lot of pastors. I think there's a lot of pastors that are not actually informed on the fact that this isn't an original to the manuscripts. And so there might be pastors that are preaching on it without that knowledge, and they may miss the opportunity to tell their congregation that. And I think they are missing on the mark, because this is such a popular story and a lot of people might bring this up in conversation. And if they've never heard that this is a textual variant or that this didn't exist in the oldest manuscripts, and they're talking to an atheist or somebody who does know that, and they bring it up to them, that might shake their faith a little bit, because they're like, I've never heard that before. I need to look into this. And then they look into it and they find, wow, he was right. What do I do with this? So I think that if we are preaching, now I'm not a pastor, but if we are preaching this text, we do need to make that known, and like you said. But now I do think that there are some pastors out there who they have a personal conviction in the idea of preaching this text. And I think that if you do have a personal conviction about preaching it, that you shouldn't preach it. Right. I think that if you have a conviction and you feel like it might be sinful to preach this text because it's not in the oldest manuscripts, then you should probably stay away from it.
Absolutely.
But yeah, like you were saying, like you can't really exposit it because it's kind of out of its historical context in a sense. It's like in a weird spot. But I think that it would be totally fine to preach in principle,
Absolutely.
as far as biblical principles go. Again, there's nothing that's off in this story. There's nothing that's in it that really can't be found other places in the New Testament. So I think it's totally fine to preach as in a principle to apply or to understand as far as the grace and mercy of Christ goes. And but again, I do think we should be informing our the people of our churches, our congregations. We should be informing them of this text. You're like, hey, you may not have heard this before,
right?
And this isn't to stir any kind of, doubt in you as far as your faith goes. And I don't think that it should. Again, I really don't think it should. It's not. Again, when you go back and you look at the history of it and you see how this came to be, it does make sense. But I think we do need to bring that up because I think there's probably a lot of people in the pews that don't know this, that they're not aware of that. And they miss those little notes in the text.
Right.
A lot of people kind of skim over those. They're like, oh, whatever,
brother, that I would love to say that they skip them or they don't notice. Many Christians don't read the Bible. They've heard the story from watching YouTube and listening to the pastors. And as you mentioned before, some of the pastors, don't go. I mean, in Bible college, I don't really believe I didn't have a class on this. I didn't have a class on textual criticism, and I'm in apologetics.
Right.
And so for you and I who are in apologetics, this is kind of our field and our practice. We try to surf out things that people will use against the faith and throw it back at them. That's what we do. But the average Christian is not diving into textual criticism. And like you mentioned, they don't even understand it. And what I think this passage can do is if you have a person that grew up in the church, and I say that to say, it's a little bit deeper than surface level, but they don't read their Bibles often, but they understand most of the stories. Most of them think that the words in this printed text that they hold in their hand is the infallible text, and that the fact that we're saying that this probably isn't what John wrote can definitely throw them off. Definitely, because it's shifting their whole mindset. Well, if this isn't in the Bible, what else is wrong that they've told me? Yeah. And so if the pastor doesn't preach from the pulpit and say things like this, then you have someone who watches this on YouTube and says there's some title about the woman called an adultery. So they watch this video and you have an apologist or a historian saying this isn't in the Bible. It could shake. I mean, anything can shake their faith. That could be major in someone's life. If you think about it, it could be major. I mean, I remember when I first started studying this, you kind of take it on faith that this is the text. I mean, this is the text,
Yeah.
and you don't really think about you don't really think about the literal copying of manuscript to manuscript. It's not something that comes into your head, because you just kind of take it, well, this is the Bible, I believe it. It's all kind of faith,
Yeah.
right? And you don't really think about it. But then when you sit and think about, well, men wrote it. Yes, they're inspired. No question. Men wrote it, and they physically wrote it, right? They did. In other words, it's not like they thought about it and it appeared on the page. So that the physical writing of it, and the men, what the Holy Spirit inspired was the content, right? Not, I think we've got to be very careful when we go back to, like, he inspired the letters, and he did in a way, but he's inspiring the content, and we have the content back to the 2nd century and the 4th century, right? And so we know what the Holy Spirit inspired, but, like, we have to be careful. You go down these other streams of, like, the inerrancy of the English text and the inerrancy of the KJV, and you have to be very careful there, because any other variant, you fall into this hole of, like, well, that's unbiblical and that's unbiblical. Well, technically, this will be some content here. None of these are the manuscripts. None of these that we hold in our hand,
right,
is what we're saying is sola scriptura or infallible. These are copies, right? And I don't think we talk about that enough, because we have this idea that, and I do too sometimes, that, like, this physical Bible, the physical book, is important to us, and it's important to me. So sometimes I don't put a pen on top of it, and I don't put my coffee cup on top of it, because it's important. But it's also not, it's a copy. It's a copy. And so we have to keep that in mind, that these guys over centuries physically copied the Bible, which, I don't know if you're looking at yours, but if you're looking at mine, is 1,000 pages, right? And that's just because of the print, right? But the point is, there's going to be variance. You couldn't do it otherwise. So
Yeah.
God in his, so God, I think it proves the Bible, because God in his providence through men gave us the product of what he's trying to convey to his people.
Yeah.
Right. Which is what we hold in our hands. So, but, long tangent aside, what I'm getting at is, if pastors don't mention these type of things from the pulpit, I think you're not giving your people the full story of, I'm not saying every pastor's, their niche is going to be to talk about textual criticism as a sermon. But when you get to this, if you're expositing John, you have to stop here and mention that this is likely not what John wrote. You're doing a disservice. And as you mentioned, it's a sin to be misleading, and it's a sin to not say, this isn't in the early manuscripts. I mean, the other side of this corner, there are pastors that believe this is what John wrote,
right?
And that's a conviction that they have. I think that they're wrong. I think that the evidence is overwhelming that they're wrong, but they just convicted. They think that this is what Jesus would do. That's in their Bible today, and so it's in the Bible, and they're in error. Do I think that it's going to? I don't think they're in the same category as a pastor that knows it's probably not what John wrote, but then they're still using it for emotional purposes. I don't think that they're in the same level, but they're both in error, and call it different ways. But you have to teach your people about these criticisms and about these variants, because, as you mentioned, not every atheist even cares about this stuff, but there are many that study this more than we do to catch us. And if you're a pastor and you're not prepared, not only could it shake the pastor's faith, as you mentioned, you don't have a footing against the atheist's arguments.
Yeah.
And that's why we do apologetics, is because we know we have the truth, and a worldview that explains everything, the only worldview that explains everything, even to communicate, and they don't. But when you have somebody who doesn't have that type of footing, then you're in a real problem to try to save souls and convert hearts.
Yeah. I kind of want to speak to something you were saying, and then you can you tell me if you agree or not. Now, with what we have in the Bible, I do believe that we have what was originally written, and therefore I do believe that the Bible does contain the infallible, inerrant words of God. But when we do talk about the infallible, inerrant words of God, I think you hit on this, is that we're referring to what was originally written. So what we have in the oldest manuscripts, what we have that was originally written, is what is infallible and inerrant, right?
Amen.
Now there could be some things in our Bibles that perhaps are not infallible and inerrant because we don't have or because we have things like this that were not part of the earliest manuscripts. So does that make sense? So I think, and you said this earlier, is that we have all of the original writings, but we also have a little bit more, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we have what's infallible, and we have what is kind of perfectly preserved by God. We have the words of God in the Bible, but we also have some things that are maybe came a little later and are maybe extra and weren't part of the original manuscript. And those things we could trace back, and we could say, okay, that wasn't part of the oldest manuscript tradition. That's probably not original. So that part is probably not infallible and inerrant. But all of the other things, through the art and science of textual criticism, we can determine, okay, those are obviously the words of God. We have all of the originals. Does that make sense? Do you agree with that?
I agree. It does make sense, and I agree. So what we say is, and you'd rather have more thrown in with asterisks, right? I would, right? So I'd rather have this story in the Bible, but the heading that says it's not in the earliest manuscripts, because if by the rare chance it is what John wrote, then you have a real problem, right? So, and that's why we arrived at the English translations we use today. But like you said, what I'm trying to convey is this Bible that's on my desk does contain all the infallible writings of John, Mark, Luke, and everybody else, and probably a little more. That's what I'm saying. And the reason we know that is because we have the manuscript tradition. Now, that doesn't mean we look at, let's say, Codex Sinaiticus, and we can point to that specific manuscript and say, this is the one that's infallible. But because we have thousands of them, we arrive at what is infallible based on this. So we know what John wrote. And the way to just kind of judge, I'm not saying that, when we say that the difference in this being infallible and the tradition being infallible, or the number of manuscripts that we have, is just look at translations. It's very difficult to say these literal words in English are infallible because the content is infallible. But because we have different translations, we use different words, and we also use different languages when we translate it to Spanish and all the other languages across the world that the Bible's been translated. But we know what John 1:1 says. And so that if you have word or God reversed in the sentence, you don't lose what the sentence is saying. Like the NIV is more a thought for thought, and the ESV is more literal. That's fine. There's no issue there. But if you get down to this Bible, this one on my desk is the only one that's correct, and every other translation isn't, you have problems. And that's where we get down to the stream of the KJV. They have problems because you look at Matthew, they say, well, these people have deleted verses. Again, we don't this I know that we're not talking specifically about this, but to the point.
Yeah. Right.
All you have to do to find the answer to those questions is the manuscript tradition, and you can trace them. And because we have the manuscript tradition, you can look up Sinaiticus online. You can literally see everything that it says from the 4th century. So I'm going to go to that source,
Yeah.
to find out what happened. And so that's when you get into the issue with the English printed versions. This Bible contains everything that John wrote and maybe a little more, and the same with all the other ones. So this book is the infallible word of God, as long as I know that I'm not going to take my NIV or whatever NASB and say, well, this word's different here, that there's a problem. We already have the source. This isn't the source. We have the sources. And so we know that we can understand why this one says this word and this one says this word. I will speak if you do permit me.
Go for it.
I think that words do matter, and I think that the Greek words. I'll be very clear here. When Paul writes a word, he means to write that word, and I think it is up to the translators to do their due diligence to see what Paul's trying to describe. Because you get down to this argument in apologetics all the time when you talk about words like arsenokoinai, homosexuality.
Right.
Well, they love to that word. That word is the word Paul chose. That word,
and it was actually a new word that he created
He created the word, and he translated the Latin Vulgate from Leviticus to make up that word. And so that, I also think, again, a little Bible nerdy, all that stuff's important to know too, and why we use certain words. But again, that's from thousands of years of historical manuscripts to arrive to these. That's because we have those manuscripts solves all the problems.
Yeah.
That's really so the English, the reason we have the English the way it is today is because we have all the manuscripts. And so the manuscript tradition and the manuscripts themselves, we know what John wrote, and that's really what we try to do. So we can be very, very confident that when we read John 1, we know exactly what John is saying in John 1:1 because we have it. We already have it. So that's my caveat.
Yeah, well, it's funny because I was actually having a conversation with a buddy at work, and he brought up, we kind of he's actually, from what I understand, he's a believer, but he's very new to it, I think, and so he has a lot of questions, and I think he's attracted to Catholicism because of the tradition. And, I think the same reason that a lot of young people are attracted to it is like they look at the Catholic Church and they're like, there's these beautiful traditions and it's the same everywhere you go. Right. Like you're not going to just walk into like some random evangelical church and one of them might be some guy rolling around on the floor, speaking,
which does happen,
speaking in quote unquote tongues and, whatever, you know what I mean? Like you're going to get the same thing everywhere. And I think that that's what people are looking for is like order. And especially after something like COVID, where there was just no order, it was all disorder. And they're looking for this. I want the same thing every week. And so I think, anyway, I think that's why he's probably attracted to it, which I think are all good things. I don't have any problem with that. There's other issues that I have with the Catholic Church, but that's aside. But anyway, he was kind of getting into that, and he was like, well, what about the stuff that was removed from the Bible? And I was like, was it removed or was it just never there?
Right.
Or was it actually added? I was like, that's the question we have to ask, because when we go into history, we go into the earliest manuscripts, it just wasn't there. Right. So nothing was removed. Actually, It's like the more modern translations are actually being a little more accurate to the history of the manuscript tradition. Is that we're showing you what was actually in the earliest manuscripts, not actually what was maybe added later. So I think that's an important distinction to make as well. But it's funny, we were talking about Jesus writing in the sand earlier. just like a little side note, I know there's like somewhat of a discussion online as to like, what do you think he wrote?
Right.
I don't have, I think he wrote like Jesus was here circa, 30 AD or something like that. I don't know. But yeah, I think it's kind of funny. People just speculate like, oh, he probably wrote this. It's like, I don't think we have any idea of knowing, what the story would have said that he wrote.
No, we don't have any idea. I think the most popular explanation or trying to, again, without really any evidence besides the little verse in the text that says they left oldest to youngest, the most popular story is that he wrote the names and their sin, and that's only because that line says they left kind of one by one, and where like he would kind of call them out like, okay, well, this is Thaddeus and he's an adulterer, and so they really didn't have a leg to stand on, and so they walked. But there's no real evidence besides that.
Right,
he could have wrote anything. I mean, again, we talk about the story in itself is compelling. That makes it a little bit more compelling because now Jesus is like being kind of like, he's kind of being like a little bit of a gangster saying, dude, you did this. And it's kind of a cool way to think about Jesus. And I think that's kind of how it probably populated, is because like, oh man, what if Jesus was writing their names? But that's really the largest, most popular explanation of what Jesus was writing. Of course, we don't know at all what he was writing. Again, I'm in the frame of talking about this. I am saying that I don't think John wrote this, but again, this history, there's a lot of evidence that it is a story. So let's say that it is. It does seem a little odd that Jesus would start writing their names, so I don't know. Maybe some people think that he was just doodling in the sand, buying time for them to stop talking, and then kind of say his line, his one-liner that shut them all up. Well, who among you hasn't sinned? You throw the first one, and then it was like, okay, well, obviously we don't have anything to do now.
He was really just playing a game of chess with himself. He just.
Right. He's just like, yeah, I'm going to create this game. And because chess is straight from God. If you play chess, you know that. He's like, I'm going to create this game and start, but I think it's one of those things that just it's one of those discussions that's just fun to talk about. So people talk about it. And I think it's like we said in the onslaught of this podcast, there's no real hate or anger coming to anybody who talks about this type of stuff. This is more fun. The only indication I would say of like any type of ill feelings would be those pastors that really believe that this is part of the Bible, and fine, right? I'm not here to condemn you. If you're convicted that way, you're convicted that way. I think that but we would say that about theology. We would say that about many things. Whatever eschatology you believe, however you believed God changes the heart, whether he's right at the door and you open it, or whether he threw you the life preserver and you grab it, or you're dead in the bottom of the lake. However you want to say those type of things, they're way more important than this. More important than this. And so I think this is fun to discuss, although important. Let's not minimize the importance of it with the fun part of it, but like, because we talk about, maybe this is one we'll do one day, but the KJV stuff, right? And it's not exactly this topic, but it's very similar to this topic because their standard is the 1611 KJV. That's their standard, and so which is so strange,
which nobody
because well that's number one, and two. It's a copy. It itself is a copy. So how can the copy be the standard? It's logically it's a fallacy, because
you've skipped past the foundation to something that's on top of the
foundation.
For
15 centuries. Yeah. For 15 centuries, there's manuscripts that have been circulating. When Erasmus wrote it, he copied printed texts. Not even so it is interesting to say, the debate about the modern translations versus the KJV, and it's like, all the modern translations did was go off of the earlier manuscripts, and that's why we arrived at our Bibles today. And so, by the way, even the New King James used those manuscripts, or so.
Yeah,
I mean,
right.
it's kind of a weird discussion. It's kind of one of those things that like they just know it, so they know it, and I don't really have to prove it to you. Type of conversations, which is a little silly when you're talking like a logical conversation with people.
Yeah.
But that's and you know this from being an apologist. That's a lot of times where you arrive. That's just where, like, if you're talking to an atheist, they just believe it. They don't really have a reason, but they just.
Yeah.
And we know the reason is it's a heart problem. You're God, you're your own God, and so you don't want a God who tells you what to do because you want to do what you want to do, and we know that. But they don't. They just,
Yeah.
they don't.
Yeah,
they don't want to.
Like one of my favorite things to go to, somebody's like, I think John originally wrote that story, or I'm a KJV onlyist. It's like, well, I'd agree with you, but then we'd both be wrong, and we can't.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
But
yeah.
I know we talked about in the beginning of this episode that we might get to the long ending of Mark, and we're right at an hour now, and so I don't think that that's going to happen, but maybe that's a topic for another episode that we could talk about, because that's also another interesting text and thing to talk about, especially when you get into like snake handling and things like that. So we'll put a pin in that one, and maybe we'll come back to that, and we could come back to the KJV only discussion, and so we have quite a few episodes that we could do together in the future here. If you're willing and you want to come back
absolutely on. No, these are fun. These are the ones that are, every once in a while you got to throw in a deep one, a hard one that's going to stir some emotional, but it's really nice to just nerd out on the Bible, and that's kind of refreshing because as I mentioned at the on, I've been involved in the abortion stuff I've been kind of inundated with that for a month since we got that thing going, and so obviously that's an emotionally jarring topic,
that's a big one.
Being enriched in that and writing the things, and then so it's nice to be like, okay, let's just have a fun topic about textual criticism. It's kind of nice. So I appreciate that.
Yeah. I agree. I definitely agree. It is nice to not feel like you're in battle for once, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, man. Well, Ben, I appreciate you coming on and talking about this topic of is the woman caught in adultery original? Is it not original? Should we preach it? Should we not preach it? I appreciate the study you've done on it, and being able to come on and talk about it, and being flexible again this morning while my life was not all put together. So it happens, kids, and not waking up as early as I should have, and just miscalculating things, and what can you do? But I appreciate it, man. And just want to say that anybody who's watching or listening to this episode, as always, thanks for supporting the channel and for listening. Make sure you check out Ben's channel as well. Again, that is Grace and Truth Ministries. I'm sure. Can you just search Grace and Truth Ministries on YouTube and podcast platforms, and that's what you come up there?
Yep, YouTube, TikTok, Face, all the socials. You can find me. There's a website too, graceandtruthapologetics.com. There's some blogs and things on there.
Sweet. Yeah. So look up Ben, subscribe, follow him on all of that stuff. Support this man and what he's doing, especially with his work in ending abortion in Maryland, and working with the Apologia team and trying to do that. And like I said, we'll have to get together, or you can text me some information afterward, because that's something that I would love to also do here in Delaware. But again, thanks, brothers and sisters, for watching or listening. And remember to always be able to give a reason for the hope that is in you, and to do that with love and respect. And we will see you next time.